Okay, let's stay optimistic. If that's justified, is next year actually looking better than we feared for a long time? Well, joining me is economist Judith Sloane, a former productivity commissioner and our columnist with the Australian newspaper. Judith, the Reserve Bank says that the recession may already be over. Property prices seem in most cities to have bottomed, starting to rise a little bit. Unemployment, not as bad as tipped a couple of weeks ago. Are we in better shape going into next year than a lot of people would have assumed?
Well, I thought the Deputy Governor was perhaps jumping the gun a little bit. I mean, and I guess he was making the technical point that the economy's probably bottomed, and from a bottom you go up, right? So I guess he was making the point that it's unlikely to have, we're unlikely to have another negative growth figure in this quarter, and so technically we're out of recession. And look, there are some positive. Okay, but there are some positive signs. But let me give you this big qualifier. You know, the government is continuing to intervene in a massive way in the economy. So we've still got JobKeeper going, we've still got JobSeeker going, we've still got, well, we're going to get JobMaker. If you look at the budget figures, they're absolutely extraordinary. I mean, there is going to be a budget deficit this financial year of over $200 billion, or 13% of GDP. So that's why I'm kind of a little bit more reserved, because there's an awful lot of propping up going on. Now, that propping up can't keep going. And what we don't know at a kind of more micro level is the extent to which businesses won't recover and won't re-emerge, and employment won't bounce back to where it was. So I think we need to just hold our fire a bit in terms of making any broad assessment of where we're going.
And look, I think you're absolutely right. We do need to build on what little signs of hope there are and do a hell of a lot now. What needs to happen in order to start digging ourselves out?
Well, now bear in mind, one of the complications of all of this has been that we've essentially got, well, in a way, a three-speed economy. So we've had Victoria, and you covered that extremely well. And, that's really where the major economic problems are. And, it's about 25% of the economy, but about 40% of the government transfers are going to Victoria at the moment. The other states, but absent, and this is the third element, of the border restrictions, are kind of chugging along not too badly, right? So life has returned to relative normality in those states, but the border closures, including the international border closures, will have a very big impact on the economy. So, I mean, I think that factor alone makes you a little bit cautious of what 2021 is going to look like. Yes, obviously it's not going to be as bad as 2020, but there are still some major constraints on us bouncing back.
Okay, now one thing I think we cannot now do to hurt ourselves, hamper this recovery, is make electricity even more expensive with this green push for, green electricity. But the media left was excited today, Judith. I can't tell you that the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, had told our Prime Minister in conversation it is time for bold action on climate change. Not that Scott Morrison seemed too keen today to follow that advice. Here he is.
One thing the British Prime Minister and I agree on is that achieving emissions reductions shouldn't come at the cost of jobs in Australia or the UK. It shouldn't come at the cost of higher prices for the daily things that our citizens depend on.
Judith, finally, quickly before we go, do you think we should follow the British Prime Minister's advice on green energy, given that electricity prices in Britain are 1/3 higher today than they were a decade ago?
Well, no, absolutely not. And I mean, he's gone a bit bonkers on this stuff, Boris, hasn't he?
Yes, very great disappointment.
They're very dependent actually on the cheap gas from the North Sea, which is about to run out. So actually I'd come back in about 5 years and see what Boris has got to say about all this. And interestingly enough, in the the Brexit negotiations, the French are threatening not to send their nuclear power over the channel. So there's a lot of water to go under the bridge before we see what, Boris, I think he's good at the gesture, let's face it, but we'll see what happens in due course. And I think Morrison's absolutely right to say that he makes policy in the best interests of Australia, not anything else.
Judith Sloane, thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure, Andrew.
And I should note also, for all those Greens cheering Boris Johnson up, what a disappointment to the Conservatives has been, that Britain actually does get 3/4 of its electricity from things that the Greens actually hate. Fossil fuels like gas and also nuclear power, by the way. That's banned here. Biomass, that's just burning wood chips. Can you imagine our forests going for that? Coal, oil and dams. When were the Greens last wanting to build more dams? And when the wind fails, Britain does have a long extension cord to Europe, mostly France. It's nuclear power, as Judith just said, to keep the lights on. That's 8% of its power. Do you think the Greens are going to let us have nuclear power? Are we going to run an extension cord to the nuclear power in, I don't know, Japan? Where have they got it close to us? So that's another reason to be optimistic. We don't need to follow Britain's advice to go green. Unless we do become nuclear, and that's not all bad. Well,